Well, we don't have direct, bomb damage assessments. There's lots of film footage coming out that shows some fairly extensive hits. And of course, as noted, the attacks are continuing. I think it is interesting to see that we have yet to see a significant response from Iran. That could indicate that at least their ballistic missile capabilities have taken a hit. But again, it's too soon to know. Iran could just be biding its time and waiting, but I think some sort of Iranian retaliation is certainly to be expected.
With reports from the Associated Press, Mona, suggesting that we're now hearing explosions near the Fordow underground nuclear site. What does that tell you about Israel's plans to so-called close the deal this time?
Well, Israel has made it very clear. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that Israel will not tolerate Iran gaining any sort of a nuclear weapons capability. Fordow is the mother lode, if you will, of Iranian uranium enrichment. It is deep, deep underground. There are real questions as to whether Israel has the armaments, the bunker busters, if you will, that can penetrate. So time will tell.
Well, it certainly will. And when we consider that, that gets to the U.S. position, Mona, where we have seen some conflicting characterization as to what extent the U.S. Knew of this attack or supported it. As Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, immediately last night acted to distance the U.S. government from Israel's action. And yet President Trump today is signaling that this never would have happened without U.S. military technology that Israel has access to. What role do you expect the administration to play in what happens moving forward?
Well, how much the U.S. knew in advance, I think, is going to be a question that we will all be learning about in the coming days. But I think what is clear is that the United States is not interested in taking on an offensive role in this military engagement. We are seeing U.S. military assets being flown in and coming in by sea to the region, but that is largely for a defensive posture, both to protect significant U.S. assets and, of course, Israeli forces as well.
We saw strikes and responses, tit for tat, a couple of times last year, Mona. Are you thinking of that again in this case, or is this the beginning of a war between Israel and Iran?
Yeah, I think this is a distinct departure from what we saw last year, which were, as you noted, limited tit-for-tat attacks that came to a quick conclusion. Already, Israel is signaling that it intends to continue its campaign for days, if not weeks. And we know Iran has said that this is a declaration of war. And so I'm afraid that the region is really at an incredibly perilous moment, one that has been long feared, where it really could fall into the abyss of a region-wide war.
Well, and what role will Iran's proxies play in that, Mona, knowing that they have been greatly diminished over the last several years as Israel, of course, has waged an ongoing war against Hamas, has acted to take out Hezbollah. The U.S. had reached at one point recently a truce with the Houthis. I don't know if you think that will stand, but what role will those proxies play here?
Well, I think that's a big question, and this in part may account for Israel's timing of the attacks. Hezbollah, it's Iran's primary proxy, its second strike capability, if you will, was largely decimated last year. And Hamas, too, has had extreme damage to its forces. That leaves the Houthis, and I think the Houthis are a wild card. We should not underestimate the Houthis' capabilities. We'll have to see what they do, whether they choose. They have already launched attacks on Israel in the past. Do they join the fight? We're going to have to wait and see.
You mentioned the lack of response, or at least the slow response from Iran, knowing that a lot of things could still happen, Mona. Does that speak to disruption at the top of the chain of command following the killings we saw last night?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing fairly significant decapitation of Iran's military and paramilitary forces. There's no question this has put Iran on the back foot. And this might account, again, for the fact that we're not seeing right now a significant response. We'll have to wait and see where things go. But Iran has certainly suffered some fairly significant blows over the past 20 months. Whether or not it is completely down, I think is another question. But I would always say, we should never completely count Iran out. It will find a way, I think, to respond.
Well, President Trump today has suggested multiple times that some of the individuals inside Iran's chain of command that the U.S. was negotiating with, trying to come to terms with, are now dead, Mona. And I wonder, as we consider the future of those negotiations, knowing that sixth round of talks was set to take place this weekend, if you think there really is a future, does this add to or diminish the chances of reaching another nuclear accord between the U.S. and Iran?
I'm afraid this dramatically diminishes those prospects. It's hard to imagine negotiations going forward, given everything that's just happened. I think, best case scenario, these talks are put on the back burner. But again, I think we're entering, unfortunately, a new and very scary period in the Middle East, one that's really going to be dominated more, unfortunately, by military action to resolve problems rather than diplomacy.
Well, by extension, Mona, you wonder about talk. It was only months ago there was talk about expanding the Abraham Accords, that normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia was at last at hand. How about now?
Well, already prospects for Israeli-Saudi normalization were diminishing given the deepening conflict in Gaza. Now, I think it's virtually impossible to imagine how that goes forward. I'd note that when we look at responses from the region to Israel's attacks, among the most vocal critics of the attacks was Saudi Arabia. And Saudi, almost in the quote from the king, seemed to align itself with Iran. So I think Saudi-Israeli normalization is at, really, I wouldn't even call it a distant prospect. I think the chances for it right now are next to nil.
Well, I wonder, Mona, how much you think that might have to do with Saudi concern or concerns of any oil producing country in the Middle East about Iran potentially going after their production capacity or taking the perhaps most dramatic option of closing off the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Do you think that's a realistic possibility here?
I don't, in the sense that I think that Iran would essentially be shooting itself in the foot. I don't see that happening because it would, of course, dramatically imperil the global energy supplies, and Iran would suffer as a result. The other thing to keep in mind is just prior to all of this happening, there really had been an interesting and marked warming of relations between Iran and Gulf Arab countries. I sense that Iran is going to want to actually protect those relationships now more than ever. So I don't see Iran doing anything to provoke its neighboring Arab countries.
We just have about a minute left, Mona. Is Jordan the most nervous neighbor in the neighborhood?
I think Jordan has a lot to fear. Absolutely. People, colleagues and friends there already reporting concerns, sirens going off. Jordan is not a country that is used to daily warfare and fighting, and it is right now on the edge of the kind of most intense fighting. And so where things go in Jordan, I think we're going to need to watch very, very closely. But I'm sure that the Jordanians are deeply, deeply concerned about the spillover of this conflict into their country.